we've been in the Old Testament now for a long time. I'm not sure how many weeks, but a long time. But we're taking a 2-week hiatus from moving through the Old Testament. We made it through Exodus 32-ish, and we'll get back to that in a couple of weeks. But the reason for that is this. I've had a friend of mine who's asking me to come speak at a conference he's having over a weekend in a few weeks. And the topic is apologetics. Is my wife in here? She's not. We can get my computer. It's in my desk in the front drawer. I don't know if this iPad's going to work. The topic is apologetics. So it's a lot of different questions about the Bible and about God and about Jesus and a lot of the tough questions the culture is currently asking. And I said, that sounds great. How many times will I be speaking? He said 4. And I said, what would you want me to talk about? And he sent me a list of questions to talk about. And there were 68 questions. And all of them would be enough for at least one lesson. Multiple of them we've spent like multiple Wednesday nights on here alone. So what the plan is the first 2 lessons I'm going to talk about big things, existence of God, arguments, and then the resurrection. And the second 2, I'm just going to basically, thank you. I'm going to basically go rapid fire. What? You need the cord? No, I don't think so. I'm going to go rapid fire on all the other questions, which is about 55 other ones. And what I need to know is basically how long it's going to take me, how quick I need to move, and those things. So this will help me do that. So it'll be a little bit unorthodox in that I won't really be asking for your questions and stuff until the end or your thoughts. But I would love it, because these are a lot of controversial issues, I'd love it if you would write down your questions or jot down your thoughts as we go, and then at the end you can bring them up or ask your questions or whatever it is. Or you can just listen. We're going to move through these pretty quickly, so I made some screens for you guys. We usually don't use the screens on Wednesdays, but we've got them tonight so that we can kind of hopefully keep up with what we're talking about. Okay, the first one's one we've talked about a lot at the church. It's 6:38. All right, that's for me. We've talked about this one a lot. I've spent a good bit of time on this, so we won't spend a lot of time on it here. But the first question is probably the most common question asked in our culture today about God, which is something like this. Why would a good God allow evil to exist? Why would a good God allow suffering to exist? We've given a lot of answers to that before, but the ones that I think are the clearest and most succinct are that just because you can't see a reason for something doesn't mean that there's not a reason. That's the old Alvin Plantinga argument with the dog in the doghouse and the no seams in the doghouse. If you remember that, if you don't, it's okay. But there's this argument that says if God is big enough for us to be upset with for not stopping suffering, right? That if God is so big that we think He could stop suffering, He must also simultaneously be big enough to have reasons for suffering that we can't see, right? So if God is big enough to stop suffering, He must also be big enough to have reasons for suffering we can't see. There will be moments of suffering in your life that you can see good reasons for. You can look back on suffering in your life in the past and see what God did through that suffering, and even through evil in the same way. But there will be some times in your life where you will see suffering or you will see evil, and you will think, I cannot see one possible explanation of why God would allow this to happen. But the answer is, just because you can't see one doesn't mean that there isn't one. Very often, my young children don't have any idea why they are being disciplined. But just because they don't see a reason doesn't mean that there's not one. And the same thing is true ultimately about God. There's three basic answers biblically to the question, which is something like, number one, for real freedom, that there must be opportunity for evil. Otherwise, if there was no opportunity for evil, there would be no opportunity for real choice or real free will. And God intends for you to have real choice about whether or not you're going to follow Him, whether or not you're going to turn towards Him, and the necessity of good and evil, suffering and non-suffering, forces those things. Also, we know that suffering and evil make us stronger, right? The Bible talks about suffering as a refiner's fire, that we tend to not become stronger when things are going well for us. We tend to become stronger when things are difficult, and that's one of the reasons the Bible gives us for suffering and even for evil. And then a third one is for the possibility of virtue, which means the virtue of courage, something like courage, can't exist unless there's something to be courageous in the face of, right? So if everything was easy in life, then courage wouldn't be a real thing. Bravery wouldn't be a real thing. But those things are made possible by the reality of difficult things. Those things are made possible by the reality of evil. So if God's big enough to be mad at for not stopping suffering, or evil even, He must also be big enough to have reasons for those things that we can't see. And just because we can't see a reason doesn't mean that there's not one. Okay. So, could God stop all suffering and evil? Theoretically, depending on what you mean. But along with that, he would also have to remove the possibility of having an actual meaningful relationship with you. Not to mention the fact that he'd be removing you and me, who are evil without him. Okay, second one. Why would a loving God send people to hell? When we come to each of these questions, just think for a moment about how you'd respond to this. Very common questions in our culture. Why would a loving God send people to hell? Probably the most significant issue is one we just mentioned, which is the freedom issue, that there is some real sense of freedom that God intends for us to have, and that if that's possible, if there is any sort of meaningful freedom to be had, then some sort of non-heaven must exist. Also, the Bible doesn't present God as the active sender to hell, even though it presents him as the active savior. If you end up in hell, it is because you have decided to reject God, right? It is because of a decision or lack of decision on your part. It's not because God arbitrarily decided to send you there, but because we ourselves have made the decision to ignore the God that is made obvious to us in creation and in our moral law, all those things. Additionally, if someone decides not to follow God, right, which is a decision that can be made clearly from the beginning of the Bible, one of your choices is to not follow God, not to have God, not to be close with God relationally, then in some sense, the most loving thing God could do is honor that choice. The least loving thing God could do is force you to be with him for eternity. Right? So there's even a motivation of love in his judgment. Final thought, if think about your young teenage years when boys were chasing girls all the time and girls were chasing boys. What if a teenage boy said, I like this girl and I'm going to force her to love me? You would kindly tell the boy, you just can't do that. That's not something that can be done. You can't force love. If you were to force her to go out with you, you could do that, but you can't force her to enjoy it. You can't force her to be happy about it. You certainly can't force her to feel sacrificial love towards you. The same thing is true of God, that if God is to have meaningful relationship and love between you and him, then there cannot be that sort of force that would be required to keep everyone out of hell and everyone to heaven. In order for him to do that, he would have to force you to love him, in quotes, in order to end up in everyone in heaven. So, and then there's more reasons for that, of course, like the fact that God is just and God is holy and God is free to do whatever he likes. Which brings us to the third question, which is this. Why would God command the death of so many people in the Bible? Why would God command the death of so many people in the Bible, meaning primarily and largely the Canaanites? So we get language in the book of Judges and elsewhere about the conquer of Canaan and to wipe every Canaanite off the face of the earth. That's the language. So that nothing is left breathing, nothing is left alive, nothing is left that can eat, to kill everything. Why would God command this sort of thing? Which he does. We should acknowledge that he does offer commands like that. Okay. First response is, again, God can do whatever he wants. Okay? God has the prerogative of the Creator to do whatever he wills, whenever he wills. Praise God, he is good, and so everything he does will be good, because he didn't have to be good. But God can do what he wants. Now here's a question for you is, are you okay with that? Are you okay with God being able to do whatever he likes? Because, to put it simply, if you're not okay with that, your 21st century American is showing a bit, because virtually every culture has been okay with the idea that a God is above them that can do whatever he likes, and that we're responding to that God. Okay, so if this is the case, God can do that. He's free to do that. If I draw a picture of a dinosaur and I decide I don't want the dinosaur anymore, I can crumple that paper up and throw it away. But if I draw a picture of a dinosaur and Cam comes up and grabs my paper and crumbles it up and throws it away, that's wrong, because Cam didn't have the prerogative of the Creator. The Creator can do what he wants with his creation. God is your Creator and can thus do with you what he wants. Okay, so that's part A. Part B is, God didn't command the death of the Canaanites in that way. All throughout the Old Testament especially, we have this sort of apocalyptic language where God will say things like, wipe everyone off the face of the earth, even though what he means is not that. And here's how we know this about Canaanites is a good example. So the early period of them going into Canaan, God says, wipe them off the face of the earth, leave nothing breathing, etc. And so then it says they do that. And then the rest of the book, there's Canaanites everywhere. Right? There's all kind of Canaanites. There's Canaanite women, children, there's Canaanite men. There's Canaanite cities. So what God meant when he said the thing about Canaan, wipe them off the face of the earth, whatever he meant, it was not the literal example of kill everything, because they didn't do that and they were considered faithful. There were still Canaanites left. Again, very often we have this language in Scripture, and what it is hyperbolic language to say, let your victory be ultimate. It is likely that all of the soldiers or the men who were part of the fighting army were killed. The army encampments were taken out. That seems to be the case because, again, we still have Canaanite people and Canaanite cities after the event. So when we're reading a text like Joshua Judges that is thousands of years old, there's going to be some things that are a little different than us. They don't write history the way we write history. The way we do history is modern, where everything is statistical to the point and exact. And if we say 10,000, we mean 10,000. They didn't always mean 10,000. They didn't always mean wipe them off the face of the earth literally. Sometimes they spoke poetically, very often, in fact. And I think a lot of our confusion in the modern world is because we don't read the Old Testament the way that they meant it to be read. But if you were to stop in Joshua Judges and read that verse and think, well, God commanded genocide, which again, he can do that, right? The flood largely was that. But you would miss the reality that the rest of the book proves to you that that wasn't genocide. He was talking about battle. He was talking about war. The Canaanites weren't killed. A great book on this is called Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan, if you're interested in looking at it more. But he writes on it pretty substantially. It's a big book, but it's good. Okay, next one. And this is actually one of the newest sort of hot questions, if you will. Like if you go on YouTube and start looking at atheist stuff, this is a big argument that's being made, or a big question being asked against Christianity. And it's called the hiddenness of God, or why would God remain so hidden? That is, why doesn't God just poke his face into heaven, into the clouds, so everyone can see him, do a miracle, and then everyone would believe? Right, that's the idea. Why instead is God hidden? And it gets back to, well, it's like this. Why didn't Jesus just go to the city of Rome and make a stone dove become a real dove? Why didn't he just go into all the graveyards and raise everybody to life so everyone would believe? But because the goal of God apparently is not just simple, brute fact belief. He remains hidden largely, again, for the sake of actual, meaningful relationship. If God was to do that, right? If God was to unveil himself entirely, it would be the same as removing somebody's freedom, because you don't have freedom anymore. If you see God's face every moment, and by the way, if it happened just one moment, maybe it would last for belief for like 10 minutes, but we're really good at forgetting miracles. We're really good at forgetting divine moments, and it's been that way forever, right? The Israelites are complaining the moment they get out of Egypt. Miracles don't really offer evidence to anybody, but if God was to just make himself visible at all times and you could always look up and see him, then you don't really have the opportunity for biblical belief, for biblical relationship, for freedom of choice against God. It's no different than taking away your freedom. So he remains hidden largely so that the opportunity of meaningful relationship with you is still a possibility. And the goal of God, again, is not just simple brute fact, I believe God exists. The demons do that. The demons believe in God's existence, and yet they are not gods, because that's not the full goal, for you just believe that God exists. The goal is for more than that, which would be made much more difficult if he didn't remain so hidden. Next, why is the New Testament God so much different than the Old Testament God? Because you aren't reading closely. The Old Testament God is full of grace, and we've seen this in our series. It's goodness gracious. Why has he not wiped Israel off the face of the earth yet? And he's still continually being graceful with them and making grace-filled, focused promises again and again to Israel. And the whole Old Testament, to the place we've gotten so far, is really about God's promise to his people and how he is being faithful to them as a gracious and loving groom with Israel, his bride. So the idea often is that Old Testament God's really mean, the New Testament God's really nice and loving. But it's really a surface-level idea of God. When you read the Bible, you see that that's not the case. You read the New Testament, and that's the first time you hear about hell, which is far worse judgment than anything you read about in the Old Testament. Whatever it is, it's worse than that. And so you see the wrathful God in the New Testament just as much, if not more in some sense, than you do in the Old Testament. You see the graceful God in the Old Testament just like you do in the New Testament. The New Testament, I think, gives us a clearer picture of both, really. Next one. Why would God need people to worship Him? Isn't that egotistical and arrogant? Why would God, so think about how you'd answer this. Why would God need people to worship Him? Isn't that egotistical and arrogant? Now, here's the question. We talked about this last week, so this is good timing. There's a connection, especially in the Old Testament, but there's a connection between how the child treats the parent and how we are to treat God. Right? We talked about last week that the phrase honor, which is used in the Ten Commandments, is only used of two entities, that we are to honor God and that we are to honor our father and mother. That word honor, the same, Austin pointed out last week, is the same as the word glorify. Okay, there's a real godness to this. Now, here's why I say this. When a father says to a child to obey him, when a mother says to a child to obey her, is that egotistical? When a mother or father says to a child, honor me, is that egotistical? Is that arrogant? Or is it the direct result of the parent loving the child? And indeed, of course, knowing what's best for the child and desiring the best for the child. The good parent doesn't tell the child to obey them just out of arbitrary desire for power. The good parent tells the child to obey because he loves the child, because she loves the child and knows that the joy of the child is found in their obedience. The joy of the child is found in their honoring their parents. I today made my son go to the gym and work out. Forced him. Hope one day he'll do it on his own, but he's not at the moment, so I forced him. Now, why did I force him? Because I hate him? Of course not. It's way easier not to deal with that argument, right? That would be the easier option. I love how often that's a parental discussion. If I didn't care about you, I wouldn't care if you did X, right? If you did fill in the blank. It's because I care about you that you hate me in this moment, right? We see this relationship between the young child especially and the parent, where the demand to obey and to honor has nothing to do with the ego of the parent, if they're good parents, and everything to do with the love the parent has for the child. The same thing, of course, is true about God. That when God says, honor me, it is the full extent of the good father saying, honor me, obey me. It is that God knows it is there that is your joy. It is there that is your goodness. It is there that your life will be successful in some real sense. You'll have long days in the land, all those things. Remember we talked about in Deuteronomy 10, after Moses for the second time lists all the 613 commands of the Old Testament, he says, I've given you these things today for your good. Right? We must remember that's the truth about God. God is not this tyrant. He's not Pharaoh. Right? The whole point of Exodus we've been reading is that God is the opposite of Pharaoh. He is the good, loving father that instead of being the powerful tyrant that he could have been, was the loving father, the loving groom that brought you in. So God created you knowing your chief joy would be found in Him, in honoring Him. So the pathway to your joy is Him commanding you to honor Him, etc. And you will, as a human, you will worship something. If you don't believe me, try stop worshiping God and see how long that lasts. If you don't believe me, look at our culture that has decided they're not going to worship God and how quickly that several other very prominent gods have risen up quickly. You will worship something. Who would you rather God tell you to worship? Who would be better for God to say for you to follow than the one who is the omnipotent and full infinite goodness, the place where your idea of goodness comes from? Not to mention, of course, meekness and humility and all those things along with it. So, the father-son, father-child, mother-child relationship is a good way to think about that question. All right, next category is the category that is popular in our modern world. I was pushing my computer like that's going to do anything. What is the difference between absolute and relative truth? Between absolute truth and relative truth? Or objective truth versus subjective truth? Objective truth is something that's true no matter who you are and where you are. So 2 plus 2 is 4, always. Subjective truth is true to you depending on your opinion. So some of you think that the best ice cream is cookies and cream. Some of you think the best ice cream is chocolate, etc. You have that idea of what's true in your mind. It's true to you. Luann, what's your favorite ice cream? Oh, you just ruined the whole thing, Lorraine.
Vanilla.
Kyle likes vanilla. So can I say, is it true that Kyle's favorite is vanilla? Yes, that's true. Right? But it's a subjective truth. It's true to Kyle that vanilla is the best, even though it's not true to the rest of us because we have some taste and we're not as bland as possible. Okay, so that's absolute and objective truth. Let me see how I worded this next one. No, I don't want to do that one yet. What's being got at this question very often is something like, how can Christians have the audacity to say that our truth is objective and not subjective? Because every truth in the world right now, if you ask them, is a subjective truth. Well, look, Christianity is true for you, great, but it's not true for me. What's true for me is whatever I like, whatever, fill in the blank. And Christianity has the audacity to say, no, our Christianity is true. It's true for me, it's true for you, whether you like it or not, the train's coming down the tracks. You can stay on the tracks, pretend it ain't coming, but it's coming. It is true, capital T, true, in a culture that doesn't like the idea that something is true. So there's this, one of the greatest objections, I'm talking about probably top 3 in our current culture against Christianity. If you're a Christian, they don't mind that as long as you say every religion has truth in it. I just like Christianity. If you say it that way, they won't bother you. But if you have the audacity to say, no, Christianity is true and the other religions are false. Christianity is the capital T truth. That's when you get into a bundle, right? That's when you get into a problem. So how do you have the audacity to claim that you have the objective truth? Okay, here's one of the main answers to that. Everyone does that, right? Everyone's doing that. Everyone claims that their truth is the truth. Even the people that say there's no such thing as truth. To them, that's truth with a capital T, right? To the people who say there's no such thing as capital T truth, that statement is capital T truth. That's true for everybody, to everybody. So there's the old illustration that you'll see used. I heard it in college and thought, well, that seems nice because I was dumb in college, like everyone is in some extent. There's an illustration of 6 blind men who find an elephant. You remember this? You've read this in the book probably, or heard it from a professor. That they say that God is like the elephant, but that religions are like 6 blind men who walk up and they feel part of the elephant and they think that's God, right? So one blind man walks up and feels the leg of the elephant and says, well, God is like a tree trunk. And one blind man walks up and feels the tail and says, well, God is like a snake. And one, et cetera. So, and they say, well, each religion is like that. Each religion sees part of God, but not the whole God. And you think, well, that's nice. What a nice picture. That is American religion right there, that illustration. The problem with that, of course, is in order for you to know what the elephant is, you have to claim to see the whole elephant, right? So the person who's giving the illustration is themselves claiming to know what God looks like. So every religion says, I know what God looks like, and so does the person who says, none of those religions know the entirety of God. Everyone is making objective claims. Everyone is saying, my truth is the truth. So we're not the only ones. The issue is, somebody's right, and everyone else is wrong. That's the question. Who's right? Who's correct? Everyone thinks they got the truth. Everyone is spouting exclusive claims. It's not just us. The question is, where does the evidence point? All right, next one. What is the role and danger of using common sense in evaluating truth claims? Quick answer. All of humanity, Romans chapter 1, is given enough information to know that God exists, Romans chapter 2, and that there is moral law within them that points to God as well. So there is some sense in which common sense is a good way to measure truth claims. Let me use a random example. Let's say, for instance, a man can become a woman. Now, common sense, I think, tells you the truth about that claim, and mankind knows it, and even people who say they don't believe that are working really hard to convince themselves that they believe it, because common sense plays against the insanities. But common sense isn't enough, of course, because it may just be common to your culture. Remember, there was a time when people were saying, obviously, slavery is okay. That was common sense. And there are certain people today that are saying, obviously, there's more than 2 genders, etc. Christians think their personal religious experiences with God are any more true than those of adherence to other belief systems. So people say, well, God has done this for me, and so you should believe God exists. And to that I say, that you're right. That question is correct. There's no reason for anyone out there, if you're trying to convince someone of your religion being true, of Christianity being true, there's nothing wrong with you telling them about what your God has done for you. I think it's good. You should do that. But the Muslim's going to do the same thing, right? The Buddhist is going to do the same thing. Everyone has experiences that they have that give them confidence in what they believe. And so I try not to use my personal experiences as the only argument to a non-Christian about who God is and why He's true. You should do that, but it likely won't be convincing. Next, do all religions ultimately point to the same God? Why or why not? Again, very modern thing. Here's what you'll hear people say. They'll say something like, all religions are superficially, like on the surface, different, but fundamentally the same. When the exact opposite is true. All religions are I just lost the word. I just said it. Superficially. All religions are superficially the same, but fundamentally different. That's obviously clear, I think, with Hinduism and Buddhism, the non-monotheistic, the non-one God religions, which are so different than Christianity that it's hard to even take that seriously. Our modern culture, which is probably closest to Buddhist, if anything, where there's not really a God, and it's just kind of, if you live right, you end up in the proper domain with the divine thing, welcomed into His oneness after you've escaped the wheel of Brahma. I can't say the word right. But the monotheistic religions, which are three, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, are closer in some sense, but the central figure, obviously in Christianity, is Christ. Christianity claims Christ died and rose from the grave. Judaism claims that Christ died. Islam claims that Christ didn't even die, nor rise. So when you start looking at the details of any religion, you see very quickly that these religions cannot all be true, cannot all line up. They're saying very different fundamental things. If Christ isn't who He claimed to be, Christianity does not exist. Right? It's not like it hurts Christianity. If Jesus wasn't God in the flesh, if Jesus didn't die and rise from the grave, it is the whole religion falls apart. There is no Christianity. And obviously we're different on those things. Of course, all religions are the same except Christianity in one regard, because all religions are merit-based outside of Christianity. That is, all religions other than Christianity say something like, if you work really hard, then at the end you'll be accepted. Christianity says, I accept you, now work really hard. And here's the illustration of that. Is it's like when I went and proposed to my wife, when I went and proposed to Ariel 12 and a half years ago, 11 and a half years ago, I brought with me a cookbook, and I opened the cookbook, and I said, now here's the deal. If you can master all these recipes by the time we are 50, then I will accept you, and you'll be mine. But if you can't, the deal's off. Of course I didn't do that, right? But instead, my wife cooks for me now, and she's great at it, right? But she doesn't do it in hopes that I'll accept her, because relationships don't work that way. Because Christianity is a religion that's based around God desiring a meaningful relationship with you, and not based on whether or not you can merit getting there. Right? The way relationships work are by initial acceptance. That is, my wife cooks for me because I accepted her. I do things for her because she accepted me. So for real relationships to exist, acceptance has to happen on the front end and not on the back end, as I hope I can get there. There's no relationship in that regard. Christianity is that way. Okay, we're doing good. I'm pumped about how quickly we're moving. Jesus is the next topic. What major Old Testament prophecies did Jesus fulfill? The traditional number given is about 300 of them, but a few of them. And this is, by the way, the Old Testament, I'm talking about the most liberal scholars, like the Looney Tunes, all agree the Old Testament was written before Jesus. Okay, so everything in the Old Testament was written before Jesus. The last nail in that coffin was the thank you, Dead Sea Scrolls. Thank you, Mark. About 100 years ago, when we discovered those, which are clearly dated before Jesus and give us basically the exact Old Testament that we already have, along with more than that. So the Old Testament is certainly older than Jesus. Probably the earliest book is a few hundred years, or earliest, closest to us book, latest, I guess, is a few hundred years before Jesus. Most of them 1,000 or better years before Christ. And in those books, here's just a few things we're told of those 300. We're told by these ancient texts that the Messiah would come as a baby, which seems obvious to us, but certainly was not obvious to them. They still weren't expecting that. That he would be the offspring of Abraham, so telling us what people he'd come from. That he'd come through Isaac, so which child. That he'd come through Jacob, so which other child. That he'd come from the tribe of Judah, so which one of the 12 tribes. That he'd come through the line of David of that particular tribe. That he'd be born to a virgin mother. That he'd be born in a city of Bethlehem, not a major city. That he'd be taken to Egypt after he was born. That he would live a morally exemplary life. That when he started his ministry, he'd do it from Galilee. That he'd be introduced by a man in the wilderness. That he would draw the Gentiles to himself, which was shocking, that he would heal blind people, he would heal deaf people, he'd be ignored by most, he'd be scorned and rejected, he'd ride into Jerusalem on a donkey, he'd be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, and then offer himself up as a sacrifice. He'd have his hands and feet pierced, his blood would be spilled, lots would be cast for his clothes, he'd rise from the dead, because death couldn't hold him, he'd return in victory once and for all. And that's about 20 of them. And there's conservative numbers, 200 plus. Most common one you'll hear, if you Googled it right now, it'd probably tell you 300. Something like that. Prophecies that Jesus fulfilled. So, which major prophecies did he fulfill? All of them, all of them. And there's more than that, right? There's all these direct prophecies that we talked about, but there's also all these clear allusions to Christ that we see throughout the Old Testament that we've been seeing in our Old Testament series. If you just want one place to go to Isaiah 53, which is still never been really given a really good answer by Israel, by Judaism, about how you have Isaiah 53 and don't see Christ as that guy who was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our sins. The punishment was upon him. The punishment that brought us peace was upon him, and by his wounds we are healed, and all the things that go along with it. I don't know how you can read the Old Testament, again, all of which is dated before Christ, and not see that Christ is the one that was being talked about from the beginning. Next, was Jesus wrong about the timing of his second coming? Why or why not? If you read passages, especially like Matthew 24, it may seem like Christ thinks he's about to come back in just a few decades. Which he does, by the way. But what happens is we read those things and we think, well, Christ thought he was coming back quickly, or Paul thought Christ was coming back within his lifetime, etc. But the reality is Christ did come back, but not the way he left us, which is the promise of his second coming, that he would come back in the same way that he left. But very often in the Bible, we have the day of the Lord or the coming of the Lord, which is simply when God comes in judgment on a nation, right? That God came to the earth. God came on Sodom and Gomorrah, right? The day the Lord happened with Sodom and Gomorrah. The day the Lord happened with the Edomites in the Old Testament. So this idea of God coming doesn't necessitate his second coming, right? That sort of language is used throughout the Bible. And Christ did come in that sense in a few decades, probably in reference to AD 70, which is what Matthew 24 is primarily about, destruction of the temple and all those things. Okay, what are the key passages in the Bible that show Jesus claimed to be God? What are the key passages in the Bible that show Jesus claimed to be God? All right, let me answer it and then ask it a little tougher. So the first answer is the whole Gospel of John. Okay, so there's this modern idea which doesn't hold any basis in fact, but there's a modern idea that says Jesus never thought he was God. Christians just made that up later, right? They added that later. And so what they'll want to say is anytime you see Jesus being claimed to be God in like the epistles, the letters after the Gospels, you can't take it for real because the Christians just made that up. Jesus never thought he was God. The Gospel of John, the whole Gospel of John is very clear that Christ is claiming himself to be God, right? One of my favorites is John 8:58, where he says, before Abraham was, ego eimi, I am, using that phrase from the burning bush, which we've talked about, calls himself God, and the Jews know what he's doing, so they stand up to stone him right after he says that. Or maybe most clearly, in John 14:8-11, where Philip says to Jesus, show us the Father, and Jesus says, I've been with you from the beginning. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. That's about as clear as it gets. But now let me make the question harder, because John was the last gospel written historically. It was written sometime after AD 65. The other gospels were written, Mark was probably written at least in the 40s, maybe, or 50s, and the other two written probably close after Mark. That's the general idea. 40s, 50s, John was late. So they'll say, well, by the time John was writing, legend had already developed that Christ was God. But he never claimed that in the synoptics, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are the early ones. Right? That's the hardest version of the question. Jesus never claimed that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That just developed over time. By the time John wrote, he had claimed it. The issue is, of course, he did claim it. Now, it's not nearly as often or as explicit in the Gospel of John, but he uses the phrase ego eimi, which is the Greek version of Yahweh. Right? He says, I am, over and over throughout the Gospels, the synoptics. He walks on water and calls himself I am. He heals people and calls himself I am. Every time he does it, if the Jews are there, they pick up stones to kill him, and they say, didn't you hear what he just did? He called himself God. Anytime Jesus calls himself the Son of Man, which we often think about as him talking about his humanity, he's actually quoting Daniel 7, which is a passage that talks about the Son of Man coming in power from heaven. So the phrase Son of Man actually is the opposite of what it seems like. Jesus is saying, I am God. When he says, I am Son of Man, I am the one from heaven. I'm the one from God. He claims power to forgive sins, which clearly only God can do. He claims that he will be the one that judges people, which only God can do. He claims the ability to grant eternal life, which only God can do. And when he's accused of accepting worship as God, saying, why would you accept this as worship? He quotes a psalm and says, this is about me, clearly saying he's God. So it's a more clever objection, but it still doesn't work. The synoptics, Christ claims himself to be God there as well. Let me see how much I got this left in this section. Okay, 2 more in this section. Perfect. 2 more in this section, and then we'll stop. Finish the rest next time. What does the Bible say about the exclusivity of Jesus with regard to salvation? That is, you can only be saved by Jesus. That's the idea. What does the Bible say about that? That you can only be saved by Jesus. It says, yes. It says, you can only be saved by Jesus. Now, there is some nuance and some complicated things. But people want to make a case, and I think there's a case to be made. Like Romans 1, which is about natural theology or general revelation, which says no one has excuse. Everyone can see that God exists in Romans 1. Romans 1, 18 through 24. So that everyone is without excuse. Romans 2 talks about anyone who responds to the moral law on their heart is acting as gods, even if they don't know the law of God themselves or presumably know the name of Christ. So there's a line of thinking that says that God judges, if you never hear the name of Jesus, right, which is a common way to word it, that you are judged based on how you responded to God's natural revelation, creation, and the moral law within you, that you are judged on these bases, etc. And it's certainly true that you don't have to literally hear the Jesus name, because nobody in the Old Testament knew that name, and yet they were gods, right? They were kind of this responding to God and what they knew about God from creation, what they knew about God from the moral law, responding to him the way that he wanted them to respond, and they're saved. So Jesus is the only way anyone gets to heaven. His blood being applied is the only way anyone gets to heaven. How exactly God's going to work that out in every situation, who exactly is going to be allowed to have the blood applied to them in that sense, is up to God. God is good and right, and whatever he does will be the right decision. We can rest in that. If you want to just hold on to that line from today and deal with and just that's plenty. God is going to do what's right. Your whole idea of right and wrong comes from God. Your whole idea of goodness comes from God. Whatever the best thing to do is right. But no one gets into heaven apart from Christ's death and it being applied to them. Last one. Why did Jesus have to die on the cross for our sins to be forgiven? Couldn't God have just pardoned sins without some gruesome death involved? Complicated question, but the basic answer is because God's holy and he's a just and good judge. If some evil man comes and murders your family and then stands in front of a judge and the judge says, you're pardoned, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like justice was done? Do you feel like what was right was done? Of course you don't. And the reality is that every time forgiveness is offered, someone pays the price. Forgiveness is never actually free, right? If someone wrongs you and you forgive them, you pay the price yourself, right? You deserve something from them, and you're saying, I won't take what I deserve. I won't get even, right? You pay the price. There is no forgiveness without payment. Somebody always pays for forgiveness. And of course, that is ultimately true with God and with Christ. Because we are sinful, God couldn't just say, we'll pretend like you didn't sin. God doesn't lie. God sees your sin, knows it deserves holy judgment, and instead of making you endure it and drink that cup, he drinks it himself. so that he is both just and the justifier. So he is both holy and loving. Because his holiness says that someone must die for Renee's sins, and his love says, I'll do it myself.